Quiz Choice Online News Save Hyatt. My name is Robin Stienberg, and here we are at the Grand Hyatt. We have a very exclusive guest here. Her name is Hsu-Ming, and she's one of the great authors in Southeast Asia and perhaps even in Australia as well. With her two book releases that's been on the market in Amazon and all good leading bookstores, and two of which is Love and Vertigo, as well as Behind the Moon by her name. And Hsu-Ming, welcome to our show, the Grand Hyatt, Save Hyatt actually. And tell us, what actually inspired you, to begin writing?
I think when I was growing up in Australia, I read a lot of English literature, a lot of American literature, and a lot of Australian literature. But there weren't very many stories of, I guess, people from my own background. And after I finished my PhD in history, I had a bit of spare time, and I had done an English and history major at Sydney University, and I wanted to spend my time just exploring my background, thinking about stories that my parents told, stories that their friends told, and just thinking about the background from which they came. I never intended to write a book that was going to be published, actually.
Oh.
Yes. So I just wrote a book because I felt I just had to write. I had a few ideas for a story about people like myself, people with my own background as a migrant from Southeast Asia to Australia, particularly Sydney. And so I was writing this novel, and I work better to deadlines. So there was a deadline for a prize called the Australian Vogel Literary Award, and I thought I would use that deadline, to spur myself to finish the novel. So I finished my novel by the deadline, and I sent it in, and then completely forgot about it. And it wasn't, because I was a historian by training, so I hadn't really thought about becoming a novelist. And then, much to my surprise, to my shock, I got a phone call one day, and it was the publisher telling me that I had won the Australian Vogel Literary Award, and that was how Love and Vertigo came to be published.
Wow.
Yes. So in some ways it was almost accidental. It was just something that, that I guess I felt I wanted to write, and that I had a passion for writing. And and I think probably some of the best work comes out of just that passion, without necessarily aiming to publishing or anything, but just because there's something to say.
How does it feel to be known as the accidental writer?
Well, people don't really know me as that, because I don't think that many people know the backstory to it. But I'm very happy to be known as the accidental writer, I guess. I think there was a freedom in writing my first novel, and just the complete joy of it, that now that I am a professional novelist, I probably don't have such a sense of anymore, because now I'm thinking about deadlines and crafting the story and all of the kinds of things that goes with, I guess, a more professional attitude towards novel writing. But the first one was very special.
Okay. Now, please don't forget to get hold of her book, Love and Vertigo, by Hsu-Ming Phil, and it's available on Amazon. And Ms. Hsu-Ming, you said that this first novel is a very special experience for you.
Yes.
Tell us about that experience. In what way it is so unique to you for writing this first novel?
Okay. I started writing the novel in 1998, and it was that was the year that I finished my PhD. But it was also the 20th anniversary of the death of my aunt, and she was my mother's sister. My mother was very, very close to her, and she. My mother is Singaporean, and her sister used to live around here actually, and her sister had committed suicide in 1978 by jumping off an HDB flat, and it was one of the most traumatic events of my childhood. But it was something that was really repressed at the time, because obviously I was very, very young, and my mother did not feel she could talk about it, and so the family never talked about it. There was a whole lot of grief. There was a whole lot of suppressed memories, stories, and just feelings around that incident. So one of the things that I was trying to do with Love and Vertigo was just to work through, I guess, some of those feelings of grief and loss, not just of myself, but that my mother might have been feeling as well. One of the main, Love and Vertigo is a story about a daughter trying to come to terms with her mother's suicide in exactly that same way. Her mother jumps off the roof, of an HDB building, and it's about trying to understand reasons why people did that, and also to think about the grieving process and where you go from there. So I guess it was really, it's not autobiographical. Many people kept coming up to me at writers' festivals after and commiserating with me on the death of my mother, who's very, very much alive. So it's not autobiographical in terms of the events and all of that, but I suppose in terms of a lot of the emotions, I was drawing very much on personal experience, as most first novelists tend to do.
Well, don't forget Love and Vertigo by Hsu-Ming, and you can get it on Amazon. About the second book, Behind the Moon, does it sound like a follow-up from the first book? Because some people told me that it feels like it, but it's not. So could you explain how this inspiration came?
Yes. Behind the Moon came out of frustration, actually, in some ways, of a certain type of response to the first novel. So when the first novel came out, I had thought of it just as a story of a family trying to come to terms with its grief, and also to the whole process of migration. But Love and Vertigo was very, I think it was very centripetal in that the family, it kept folding in on itself. It's very self-contained as a unit. It had hardly any relations to the wider world because the problems just kept circling around, I guess family history and heritage and problems passed down from generation to generation. So that came out, and I guess in Australia, it was celebrated as a multicultural novel, which was fine with me. So at a time when multiculturalism in Australia was under attack, Love and Vertigo was celebrated as a novel which celebrated multiculturalism. And so I found myself talking about multiculturalism, writing about it, which was fine. But of course, being a novelist, I began to think, well, was it really a multicultural novel? And I thought, well, no, it wasn't. Maybe bicultural at best, but not really multicultural. So I began to think, well, what would a multicultural novel be like? And I thought, I live in a very, very multicultural country, and in the most multicultural of cities. So Behind the Moon, I guess, came out of that response to thinking about how do different cultures, cohere, conflict, and what does it mean to be multicultural. In Australia, we tend to think of it as multiculturalism in terms of ethnicity. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, there's different kinds of cultures. There's so many subcultures, and there's generational cultures as well. So one of the things I wanted to do with Behind the Moon was to explore the lives of young Australians growing up in the last quarter of the 20th century, and particularly based on one of my friends' experiences, to think about what it was like to be a gay Asian growing up in Australia. I guess during the 80s and the early 90s. When these kinds of things in Australia were not really spoken of that openly in Australian culture. Now, of course, everything has changed, and we have an openly lesbian finance minister in federal cabinet. So things are very different now. But I was very interested in the experiences of people in that particular type of subculture, Sydney gay subculture in the 80s and 90s. And also, so where Love and Vertigo was about family and family love, Behind the Moon was a counterpart to it in that it was about exploring love between friends, and also what are the things that hold friendships together, what are the things that make them fall apart. So I guess if people have seen continuities, it is because of that focus on relationships, first the family and then friendship circles.
Yes, indeed, and well spoken. And please do not forget to get hold of our book Behind the Moon by Hsu-Ming, and by Amazon. Hsu-Ming, I know that you're working on the third book.
That's right.
May have heard, and could you give us some glimpse into it if you can? What your third book would be and what readers can expect?
It's a historical novel this time, and I'm very interested in not necessarily recovering, but reminding Australians of the history of Chinese settlers in Australia in the late 19th, early 20th century. Because prior to the White Australia policy, there was a significant Chinese population in Australia. It was very small in terms of numbers, but it was significant in terms of the trade that it brought, in terms of the way it wove itself into Melbourne life, particularly Sydney life also. But my novel happens to be set in Melbourne, which will be a change because the first two are set in Sydney. And so it's looking at the Chinese community, what it meant to be Chinese, and what that community felt like, what they did, their allegiances to China, and how they responded to federation, which is when the Commonwealth of Australia came into being in 1901, and how they responded to the institution of the White Australian policy in 1901. That's the Immigration Restriction Act. So it's partly about that. But the main protagonist, is actually an opera singer, sort of half Chinese, half European opera singer in Melbourne, struggling to find a voice, to make a career at a time when, of course, it's very, very difficult for her to do so.
Amazing. So your third book will be ready sometime next year, I heard, or hopefully?
My publishers hope so too. Look, yes, I hope I can finish it next year.
Yes. Please look out for Hsu-Ming's book next year, hopefully, in 2013 or so. And if you could just Google her name, and who knows, you might hit jackpot for a third book, even on Amazon. Hsu-Ming, you spoke about multiculturalism, and as well as the importance of the respect for families, and so forth in the society where you're coming from. Now, could you give us some insight how important multiculturalism is today, in the society that you're coming from, and how can other societies probably able to learn and model after, based on the books that you've written, because we heard that there's some level of prejudice, and so forth. And I heard from friends who are traveling there, they said that they've been mistreated one way or another due to color of their skin. Now, I know that everywhere in this world there's always be some degree of prejudice. So, could you give us some idea of what's happening in Australia, how important multiculturalism is?
Yes. Okay, I guess first of all I want to say that Australia is not perfect. Obviously, it has a racial problem, which is historical in origins. There are certain sections of the population who still perhaps are confused about what it means to be Australian, and how you define Australianness. Australia changed very, very rapidly in a very short period of time. Practically in the last quarter of the century, you had a population which was 95% white, suddenly opening itself up to immigration. And then now when you go to Sydney and Melbourne particularly, but even Perth and Brisbane, you see Asian faces everywhere. Now, what I think is that it is to Australia's credit that we have not really had any major riots or anything, the way you see in the UK or in France, for example, in Australia, apart from the 2005 Cronulla riots. So I have to give credit to Australians for generally making that transition quite smoothly. You see, I think it's very difficult. We think about all the racial prejudice and all of that, but looking at it from the other point of view of white Australians, I think about, okay, this is not my point of view, obviously, but it must have been quite difficult to have a particular notion of what Australia is, and then suddenly have it turned on its head in the space of a quarter of a century. That's that's not even barely one generation. And have the transition mostly peaceful. Recently, of course, there have been attacks, like on Indian students and all of that. I'm not going to deny that there are problems there, just like there are problems, like racial problems in all other parts of the world. Sometimes it's opportunistic, sometimes it's racially motivated. There's no point in denying that. Having said that, however, as I said, I think that for me, Australia has been a really good place to grow up in. Yes, I have, I have encountered racial prejudice when I was growing up, but but I would be the last person to classify myself as a victim or to see Asians as marginalized, because I don't. I see Asians in every single sphere of Australian life, in all the elite institutions. They flourish there. They do incredibly well. And in fact, one of the problems, I guess, of feeding resentment is the fact that Asian kids do so well in Australia. Yes. So for somebody like me, imagine that someone with a name that very few Australian can pronounce, right? And I managed not only to become head of modern history at Macquarie University, but also to publish these books and to win prizes. You cannot say that there is racial prejudice there if somebody like me can achieve that. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, indeed. And Hsu-Ming, also one more thing. How does a Chinese, like yourself or even myself, being a Chinese Australian, diaspora means to many Chinese, and could you give some definition, in your own perspective? What does it mean for you? Because there are questions about the diaspora of the Asianness, and some Caucasians or even other parts of the world ask, what does it mean for a Chinese to be in Australia as a diaspora? So what does it mean for you?
I suppose the first and foremost thing it means is that I'm recognized as Chinese. If I were living in China, I wouldn't think about my Chineseness for a second, because I'm surrounded by people who are Chinese. But I guess, or in Singapore either. But we'll probably think about it because in multiracial state as well. But being in Australia, the first thing is that obviously I cannot escape my phenotype. I look Chinese, I look Asian. So, so one part of it is other people's perceptions of me. But in terms of what does it mean, there are so many different experiences because, Chinese Australians, Asian Australians are so diverse. They come from so many different backgrounds and have so many experiences. I don't know that one can actually distill it to a particular essence and talk about some essential Chinese Australian experience.
I understand. Yeah. Before we let you go, could you give us at least 3 advice for aspiring writers, like yourself? You have published 2 books, and it's an amazing volume. And there are others, in other parts of the world are still struggling, wanting to finish their first chapter or their first page. Would you give us probably 3 key advices how one can overcome their fear of writing and move on?
I guess the first thing is that you've got to be passionate about what you want to write about and write about what you know about. If you don't know about it, then research it. So that's the first thing, to know what you're writing about and to be really passionate about it and to feel that this has got to be a story that has simply got to be written. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what I often tell my creative writing students. I do master classes in creative writing for the Faber Academy in Sydney. And I just tell them, you overcome your fear just by writing. A writer writes. So if you want to become a writer, you just write. And I often tell them to go through a process of what I call writing the crap out. So, just write anything, write the whole story, write bits and pieces of it, but just write. And that's one way of easily overcoming the fear of the blank page and having to get everything down perfectly the first time. Just, get it out, just write the crap out, knowing that this is not going to be the final version of your novel or of whatever creative writing work you're doing. And then the third one is related to the second point, and that is the art of writing is rewriting. So the first draft is the first draft is just a crap version, and then the writer will go back and redraft and redraft and redraft and polish it until it is at a stage where they feel that they can release it into the public. And I think that if you start with passion, writing about something that you know about, if you overcome the fear of writing just by getting everything out, it doesn't matter what it looks like, what it reads like, as long as you just get it out, and then you discipline yourself to rewrite. I think that people can easily overcome their fear of writing, and that huge fear of having to produce the great Singaporean novel on the very first go.